We've seen pictures of airfields that the Ukrainians have been operating at that have been hit by over 60 munitions, but only one of them hit the runway. I mean, we're seeing this complete incapacity to use what we think of as fourth and fifth generation warfare, that we thought in the United States that the Russians were not a peer power, but a near peer power. And we're seeing none of that. But on top of that, we're seeing things that lessons they should have learned in World War II, and we know they learned in Grozny. You know, if you've got a tightly packed convoy, that means all the other guy has to do is hit the first vehicle and hit the last vehicle, and then they just dice up everything in between. That's happened dozens of times. The Russians have lost all the hard lessons that they've paid for with blood in previous conflicts, and it's just stupefying. Now, I do have a theory, and it folds into some of the other things that are going on right here with the why now. The Russian birth rate has been declining for decades. And when you have things like famines or World War, you have a lot of people who are killed, the birth rate in those years is significantly lower. And the Russians have had these things stack on top of each other, because there was World War I, then there was World War II, then there was collectivization, then there was Brezhnev. And at each stage, the kind of the melon scoop out of the demographic structure got bigger, with the biggest one of all being the post-Soviet collapse in the 1990s. Well, the people who were born in the post-Soviet collapse are now about to be all of the draftable population. The Russian demography is now in terminal decline. It is the second worst demography on the planet, second only to China. There's a topic we can kick into later. And so the Russians are literally running out of soldiers. If they didn't do this attack now, if they waited 5 years, it would be too late. They wouldn't have the army to try. And that has kind of melon scooped not just out their troops, but also their skilled labor and their leadership potential, and that includes their military leadership. So it could be nothing more than the Russian officer corps has become so small and so unskilled that this is all they can do. I have a hard time hanging my hat on that completely, but even if it's true, the Ukrainians are still going to lose this war. They're massively outnumbered, and the Russians have shown that they have a high tolerance for casualties. And the political situation in Russia has not turned against Putin. Sure, we've seen protests, and of course, Western media has followed that with ghoulish detail. But we're talking about a country that has lost millions of people in wars in the past. We're nowhere close to that. And if you add up all of the protests that have happened throughout Russia through the entirety of the last 3 weeks, you're still talking less than 0.1% of the population. Most Russians are fully on board with this, either because they understand exactly what's at stake, the future of the Russian ethnicity's existence, or they buy into the propaganda. And right now, that is the only information they're seeing. My personal opinion is that the best modern president we've had is George Herbert Walker Bush, because he presided over the end of the Cold War without a shot being fired, and he set us on the path to getting rid of 80% of the nuclear weapons on the planet. Those are a couple huge wins from my point of view. And part of the reason it worked so well is he always told people, never dance on the wall. If you've got the Russian system that is self-disarming and self-moving away from dictatorship, you do not brag about that publicly. You help them do it behind the scenes if you need to, in public if it makes sense. And because of that, he was able to push something that he called the New World Order, or the 1,000 Points of Light, if you remember that. And the whole idea was to have a conversation among the American people about what kind of world we wanted to bequeath to the next generation. Now that the Soviet monster was gone, what do we want? And we decided we didn't want to have that conversation. We punished him for it. And in the next 8 elections, 7 elections, we voted in the candidate who wanted to do less with the world. And when we got to this most recent one between Biden and Trump, we had 2 populists running who didn't even talk about American leadership at all. The only difference in terms of foreign economic policy between the two of them is that Trump ruled by tweet and then just let everything fall, whereas Biden is actually institutionalizing Trump-ish populism into American trade law and foreign policy, which makes it even more surprising that Biden has taken such a strong stance here on Ukraine. So, the fault is ours. We're the ones who have elected a litany of leaders who are populist, who have not been interested in foreign affairs, and that's led to this point. If we had stuck with George Herbert Walker Bush 25 years ago now it's been, we'd probably be in a very different place. We'd probably have a balanced budget. We probably would have been better prepared for the COVID epidemic. The Russians would probably not be a threat. China would be a radically different place. Because remember, this is the guy who was in charge during Tiananmen, and he set things into motion to take us in a very different direction. And then Bill Clinton just wiped it all away. So, if you're looking for an inflection point, that's well in the past. The great hope from my point of view, because I'm an Atlanticist, I'm a globalist, and I've kind of lost over and over and over and over again in terms of American elections. But the hope is that this conflict in Ukraine will trigger Americans to finally have the conversation that Bush Sr. wanted us to have. And if we have a national debate about our place in the world and what we want to see, maybe that will take us into a better place than we are now. But right now we're dealing with international disintegration. Because even if this war ends today, we're still looking at a multi-year energy crisis and a multi-year agricultural crisis that is going to generate famines that cover continents. And the energy crisis is going to trigger a global depression that will last years. I mean, that's just where we are now. The supply system has been disrupted on both points. And it will take us a minimum of 5 years to fix that. I'm talking more about his economic policy, especially when it comes to trade. Both him and Trump are broadly anti-trade. Every single thing that Trump did on his way out the door versus the Chinese and versus the Europeans is still there. There's actually only one thing that has changed. So, we still have all the sanctions on the Chinese. We still have all the domestic reindustrialization policies. We still have all the trade tariffs on everyone, with one exception. We did cut a deal with the Europeans, so that any steel that comes into the United States and Europe, if it's made with a lot of coal, will not get access. And that was specifically targeted against China. But honestly, I see that as just another tariff. But in everything else, he is putting the flesh on the bones that Trump started. It's disturbing to a certain degree, whether you're on the left or the right, the similarity between the two men when it comes to outcomes. Well, let's start with the headline. The Russian government has been working to undermine the United States pretty much nonstop for the last 15 years. And to a degree, they've been successful. They've been able to use things like social media and hacking, not just to interfere in our election system, but to back certain groups within the United States, and especially to inflame tensions. So Michael Moore, Greenpeace, the anti-vaxxers, the MAGA crowd, he's gotten all of these groups to get a lot more coverage than they should have. And in cases of things like Black Lives Matters and Blue Lives Matters, they've tried to arrange for them to have rallies at exactly the same place at exactly the same time. And so they've taken whatever our social divisions are and basically taken a pry bar to them to try to split us apart. And a lot of the fault for why politics have just been so toxic in the last decade, you can put squarely at Putin's feet. And I have certainly noticed on my Twitter feed that I have gone from dealing with dozens of trolls a day to like 5, because the Russians no longer have access. So the elimination of RT, the state media firm, from global audiences has been wonderful for political discourse. And I don't mean to suggest that Russians are the only problem here, but you've got to admit in the last 3 weeks, a lot of the heat in the internal political debates has gone down because social media all of a sudden is not nearly as nasty as it used to be. So that's just kind of the one general current.